What is going on, OWS Fam, DFS Fam, YouTube Fam? Welcome to our first Draftkings DFS Lab of the Week 15 slate. I am your host, JM. Keegan will be with me in a moment. We will be building a roster, talking through this interesting Week 15 slate, and kind of getting our hands dirty a little bit with how we might look to build. Obviously, as we do this, we talk through strategy, we answer questions from Keegan, and help you become a better DFS player. DFS is not a game of picking players. DFS is a game of outmaneuvering our opponent, so we will dive into some of that stuff as well. With that, I think we're ready to get started. I always forget to mention this. Throw this on 1.5x speed or 2x speed, even if you're on YouTube, and let's get started.
1 week season.
We are back. Keegan, it's been a while, man.
Yeah,
I have seen you in person. We probably talked for like 3 to 5 minutes because of all the family around. But I've seen you in person since the last time we recorded. We have not done a show since you had your situation with your job burning down. So
yeah, that was crazy, man.
I know some people were concerned. What are things looking like on your end right now?
Still looking. It's like the worst time of the year to look for a job. Like the Christmas season, like everybody's out, Yeah. No one's hiring at the moment. So just staying positive.
Nice. Yep. I mean, that's all we can do. Yeah. Well, it's weird to talk about DFS on the backs of all of that. But so you couldn't do the show that week. Then the next week I had technical difficulties where I restarted I don't know if I told you this, I restarted my Chrome browser. I hadn't closed it and reopened it all NFL season. And when I reopened it, it rebooted all of my settings back to 2020. I had all my old bookmarks. I had Fantasy Draft as one of my bookmarked tabs, which is like a defunct DFS site that went away in 2021, I think. So anyhow, I couldn't log into StreamYard to do my shows, and Aaron was on a cruise, so he wasn't seeing the security notifications that he needed to approve for me to get in. So then we went a week with no shows, and then last week with all the travel and whatnot, did solo shows. So yeah, you and I are back together for the first time, and very interesting slate on tap this week, where I don't know if you've spotted this, but probably the most interesting thing to me is we've got 7 games early, 3 games late. The 7 games early are all really ugly, and the 3 games late are not really attractive from a DFS perspective necessarily, but from an over-under perspective, they're all really attractive. And so it's interesting in that we've gotten used to seeing a games with a 45-point total, 45-point over-under, 46-point over-under, and being like, hey, this is a pretty nice game environment, because we've gotten so used to seeing games under 42. In the past, though, it would have typically been the games from 42 to 45, 46 are the games that you're kind of maybe not. And then there'd be a handful of games of 47 and above. And then games of below 40, you wouldn't even think about. You wouldn't even consider those games. So interestingly, this slate, it gives us 6 games that the over-under is 38 or lower, but then also 3 games that the over-under is 48 or higher. So it's 6 games that in the past we would have been oh, I'm not even considering these games. But then also 3 games that in the past we'd be oh, these are the most attractive games on the slate. So it's not like we have 3 high totals for this year. We have 3 genuinely high totals. And then they're all in the late slate. So there is this possibility to just roster only 1 or 2 pieces from the early games, and then just take all the information of okay, here's what I'm working with now, and then build your rosters, right before the late games kick off. So I don't know if you've thought about that at all, but that's one of the first things that stood out to me this week.
Yeah, it's funny that you said that, because that's actually what I thought about doing. I was man, with how everything's looking, I could just add 1 or 2 pieces from the early slate. And I was thinking in my head, man, what if everybody does this? And it's just such a weird, you're going to check your roster and everybody's kind of tied around the same. And one player, everybody else is unknown until
Yeah, I could see that when you said that you thought of that too. It was maybe this won't be sneaky. Maybe everybody will be doing this.
Everybody's going to be on it.
Yeah, one of the things that we see with I don't know if you've ever played the Thursday to Monday slate, but there's an edge in playing that when there's just a bad game on Thursday night, because a lot of times people will lock in that game because they want some action from that game. They want to have something to root for on Thursday night, but they don't want to just play the showdown. So almost every roster, 70 to 80% of rosters will have at least one player from that game. And it's a game that if it were on the main slate, they might totally ignore. So there are little things like that the field doesn't necessarily think through. And so I do think there will be a large chunk of rosters that are just treating the early games like normal games. But that does open an interesting strategy component of like, what is the early game that could shoot out, or what is the early game that could produce big scores? Interestingly, I don't know that there is a game that even falls into that. Bucks and Packers is maybe the closest. The over under there is 41.5. The problem there is the Packers side. They've topped 20. I think they've topped 24 points only 3 times all year. And they've allowed their opponents to top 25 points only 1 time all year. So they've topped 24 in 2 of their last 3 games, but that's still only 3 times all season that they've done it. So it's like it's the same thing as when Aaron Rodgers was there, except it's no longer even Aaron Rodgers, right? They slow the game down. They're very methodical. And they're very much like a chess match type of team where they'll take time off the play clock. They'll run the ball to set up the pass, but it's all very slow paced. So, and then they try to prevent downfield passing. So yeah, it just kind of mutes the game environments for them. Kind of hard for that to take off. I don't know. Do you see anything else in the early games where you're like, oh, this could actually turn into a shootout? Because that would obviously help us quite a bit.
No, I actually liked the Packers Bucks game that you just said. In my head, I've done it based on like how I've watched Jordan Love play.
Yeah.
Like the last few games or so, and he's just gone up from the beginning of the year so much. And that's where like my opinion came in, like my bias. So maybe I'm looking at it wrong, but I thought that could be a slate breaker.
Yeah, and I mean,
like you said, they play methodical, so
yeah, bias isn't bad though. I mean, in terms of like if you're seeing a player and you're like, I mean, you have to have opinions on players, and I think that's one of the things that can help us, because if you're playing MME, you need to have. I talked about this on the Winner Circle podcast this week, but somebody was asking like how big my MME pool is. And I'm less concerned with how big my pool is and more concerned with how tight my core is. So like this last week, I had 6 quarterbacks, but Justin Fields was 40% and Josh Allen was 30%. And so then the other 4 quarterbacks were just like dividing up the final 30%. It was like Josh Dobbs, Joe Flacco, Jake Browning, and one other cheap guy. And then same thing at wide receiver. I had 60% DJ Moore. I had 40% Amari Cooper. I had 20% or 30% of somebody else who hit. And then like the same thing at running back, right? So I'm going to have like a tight core, and then I'm going to mix and match a bunch of pieces around that. And then same thing if you're single entry or 3 max, like you're going to want a pretty tight core where you're just like, okay, these are the guys I'm betting on this week. And in some regard, that can't just be like, oh, the numbers say this or these other people are saying this. It has to be like, I've seen something that I'm going to have conviction, because you think about all the weeks, and I think this is important for anybody watching this. Like you think about all the weeks where you're like, oh, I'm scared to lose. And so I'm not going to play the guy that I'm seeing, and I'm going to listen to somebody else, and you still end up losing money, right? So you'd rather lose by being like, all right, I'm going to take a stand on Jordan Love has looked really good, right? And like last week I lost. I hate this because I run OWS, so like people listen to what I say. So it's cool when I'm all over Josh Allen against the Eagles, and then we're all over the tops of the leaderboards that week, or I'm all over Tank Dell at 3,200 and 3,600, and we're all winning money on those weeks. It sucks on a week like last week where I kind of put my stamp on the week, and I was like, I'm not playing Drake London. Since Desmond Ridder had taken back over at quarterback, they had like tried to hide him as much as possible. He hadn't topped 27 pass attempts. Drake London hadn't topped 7 targets in like a month and a half. They were playing a Bucs team that typically filters teams toward the air, but teams have been attacking them on the ground more and more. The Falcons run the ball at a rate 10% higher than expectation, which is more than any team in the leagues. And it was kind of like, oh man, Drake London's going to be popular. And like all the signs in terms of like where these teams are trending and how they're calling games and how teams are attacking him, all the signs point toward him seeing 6 or 7 targets and being really popular. Right? And then he goes out and puts up his best career game. You have to be willing to lose on stuff like that. So I always try to be cautious in like how strong I am with those assessments. I didn't do a good job of that last week. I was trying to be cautious because like there were very clear pathways to him hitting. He was on my early practice builds. And then it was like, as I dug deeper into the numbers, it was like, oh, the chances aren't as high as everybody's going to think. So maybe this ends up being the edge. I try to not go too overboard on that because I don't want to push subscribers away from a guy who ends up hitting. But at the same time, like in your own play, you have to be willing to be like, you know what, I'm going to go 0% Drake London this week. And if that's the reason you lose, that's the reason you lose, because there's other weeks where your conviction is going to win you money. So all that to say, like, I don't think that watching Jordan Love and being like, man, he looks really good is a reason to be like, oh, but maybe I shouldn't trust myself. You know what I mean? Like you got to find that avenue to be like, dude, whatever. I see it. If I'm wrong, I'm wrong. And even his scores recently, right? 10.9 last week. That Giants defense has been really good against quarterbacks of late, but 23.7, 26.6, 23.9. So, yeah, I mean, I like it. And we can even pull up like the late games where, in fact, let's go ahead and pull up the quarterbacks from the late games on your end. Like, it's not like we're excited to play Kyler Murray against the 49ers, right? So pull up Brock Purdy and you see his scores, right? He's got the 32-pointer, but you look through the rest of his season, like the rest of his season is all scores that line up with what Jordan Love has done recently. We've got Washington and the Rams. That's actually an interesting one to talk about. So if we don't hit on that one today, we can hit on it in our next show. But obviously some upside from those quarterbacks. But then you got Dallas playing Buffalo, Buffalo playing Dallas. Like both quarterbacks are super expensive. What are the chances of them putting up like 35 to 40 points? So I honestly don't even mind saying like, dude, Jordan Love plus Jayden Reed or something like that. And you end up like on a different starting point than everybody else. And then you can still leave a lot of space for these late games or play the late games differently than everybody else. Yeah, I don't know. If you did that, would you be interested in a bring back from the Bucs side, or how would you want to handle that?
Honestly, I wasn't thinking of doing a bring back. I actually wanted to like dip into the Washington Rams game.
All right.
Let's see what I can do. The problem is like you said, they're so expensive, and a lot of the guys from the late window are very expensive.
Yeah,
wide receivers and quarterbacks. Honestly, I don't know like what your opinion is on this, but I wasn't going to do too much, if at all, any of the Bills Cowboys game.
Yeah. So I think that it's all about taking a stand, right? Because then you're telling a story. And one of the mistakes that people make is just thinking like, okay, I'm going to take a piece from this game and a piece from this game and a piece from this game and hope I get everything right. Whereas if you instead are like, okay, I'm going to tell like 3 or 4 stories, it's easier to get 3 or 4 stories right and to build your roster around that. So you can tell, like I could come up with the numbers and the statistics and the storytelling of why Dallas and Buffalo is going to be a shootout and be the game that you had to have. But I can also come up with the statistics and the angles and the storytelling of why nobody in this game is going to justify their salaries. You know what I mean? Neither of these teams tend to allow a lot of points, and they've been part of shootouts lately, but the shootout side has been their side scoring points and the other team not scoring points, both of them against Philadelphia, right? Where we kind of expected them to do well against Philadelphia. The Bills have Josh Allen. And that's it. Like Stephon Diggs is not a top 3, top 5 wide receiver anymore. He's still really good, but he's not like a game wrecker. Gabe Davis is like an excellent number 3 and a mediocre number 2. Kincaid is good, but he's not a game breaker. So it's like they really are Josh Allen. And so because of that, when they're playing a mediocre defense, he's able to take over the game. When they're not playing a mediocre defense and they're playing Kansas City last week, or they're playing Dallas, like there's more opportunity for them to really slow down Buffalo. And then Buffalo does such a good job preventing points. We pull up just any Buffalo player and we can look at the scores that they've allowed. In fact, so I don't actually have it pulled up on my end, so it's hard for me to see it on that screen. It's like 17, 27, 9, 24, 24, to where like this defense doesn't give up a ton of points. Okay, I've got it on my end. So they give up 37 to Philly. That was that back and forth overtime game. They really held Philly down until deep into that game. And then other than that, like 29 in that fluky game to New England. And that's it, right? 25 to Jacksonville, 24 to Cincinnati with Burrow in that game. Let's see, 17 to Kansas City, 20 to Miami. So it's like, this isn't a pushover defense in terms of scoring. So yeah, no, I actually think that that's a nice story to tell. And if you're building multiple rosters, you can tell a different story on a different roster, but like we can pick this roster and say, let's tell a story on this one where people are on this game on high priced players and that game doesn't end up hitting. Right. And then it's like, now we have like a little bit of an edge and we can kind of build our roster around that story as well. In terms of seeing, hey, how might we be able to take advantage of that game missing? Like who are people going to be on in that game? Probably the quarterbacks if they're on that game. And then probably like, I think people will be scared to pay up for Diggs. They'll probably still want to use CeeDee Lamb. So finding like another high price piece that's leverage, or just building with like lower price pieces could give us a different roster than those people have. And I kind of think the running backs will be a little bit popular in that one. It's too early in the week to really know where the field is going, but I could see that. So kind of, staying away from those running backs going in a different direction. Do you want to start this roster with Jordan Love and one of his pass catchers?
Yeah, I'm down. Let's do it.
So it looks like Christian Watson is still trending toward missing. Kind of weird that they made it sound like it might be a short-term injury, because it looked bad when it happened, but and hamstrings obviously can flare up if you don't give them time. Jayden Reed obviously is a super sharp one to consider. We look through his game logs, and it's, the 5.6 pointer against Kansas City, but other than that, it's 4 of his last 5 games of 15 plus Draftkings points. You look back to earlier in the year when he was, he's a rookie. These were his first games with no Christian Watson. He had the 19.7, the 10.5. So I like him quite a bit. We could also go to Romeo Doubs. We could go to Luke Musgrave. Any thoughts on how you want to attack this one?
I'm cool with grabbing Reed just because we can get a little more flexible with our salary.
Yeah. And I think that people don't necessarily have at this price tag, I don't think people are drawn toward Reed. I don't think he's going to be low owned, but I don't think he's going to get up over 8-10% because there's just other people that people feel more comfortable clicking that button. They're more conditioned to clicking that button, which is why we've been able to get Jayden Reed at lower price tags at pretty good ownership discounts throughout the season. I would think that will continue this week. Though I do think this would be kind of the early game that people would be like, if I'm going to an early game, this would be the one I would look to. Okay, so let's move over to this Washington and Rams game. And one of the things that I think is important to think about this week, and I've talked about this on Winner Circle over the years. I went back to a Thanksgiving slate from 2020. And on Thanksgiving slate, I won the game changer on this slate. And it was not a 3-game slate because the Thursday night game got canceled because of COVID. So it was a 2-game slate. And I won the game changer with a 230 point score or something like that. And I used that as an illustration last year in Winner Circle to show you can build, if you find 2 right games, you can build from just 2 games and score well over 200 points, right? And I think that's one of the things that people overlook when you get to a 10-game slate is they want to pick pieces from a bunch of different games. But if 2 games combine for 60 plus points, right? I think that the scores in those 2 games were 42-17 and 42-14 or something like that, right? So it was really just 2 teams putting up a bunch of points. But because those were the only 2 games you could build around, we saw a bunch of people scoring over 200 points on that slate. So I say that to say, on a slate like this, you could pick 2 games and build almost your entire roster around it and significantly outscore everybody else if they're kind of spreading things out and if most of the games underperform. So I think that this game is interesting in that, we talked earlier in the year before Cooper Kupp came back, there was the week where I went 80% Tutu Atwell, 80% Kyren Williams, 80% Puka Nacua, which basically ensured that I was going to have double Rams on every roster and mixing and matching all these guys. And Kyren Williams scored 34 in that game. Puka scored 31. So whatever it was, 40% of my rosters that had those 2 guys paired was so far ahead of the field. I think that there's potential to do that in this spot, to say the week's pretty underwhelming. There could be a lot of games that are low scoring. There could be very few big scores. And yet there could be a pair of 30 pointers from the Rams. There could be a pair of 30 pointers from the 49ers. And so you could kind of go heavy on those teams and then fill out your roster from there. So and with the Rams, you could do it with Kyren and pick one of the wide receivers, or you could do it with both wide receivers. Or you could bet on this just being an absolute shootout. As we've said, you're typically going to get about 55 to 75 points from all your skill position players combined. But there are those rare games where you get 100 points, 110 points from your skill position players. So there is actually possibility for Kyren, Puka, and Kupp to all hit together, though we would want Stafford on that type of roster. So I'll throw it over to you for any thoughts you've had on this game. Any thoughts you have off of those thoughts?
Cooper had a good game last week. So I kind of feel like everybody's going to be leaning more towards Cooper. So maybe we grab Puka on this one. Not saying on any of the other rosters that you make, don't put Cooper Cup on there. I'm just saying,
absolutely.
grab Puka.
But yeah, you kind of take your stand on this one. Yeah, I like the idea of going to Puka in this one. I mean, the chances of you almost have to have a Rams piece on every roster this week, because there's not going to be a lot of 30-point scores, and there's probably going to be a 25 to 30 pointer that emerges from one of these core pieces. So yeah, I mean, I like the idea of going Puka. Do we want to throw a second guy on here, or do we want? Which, if we threw a second on, it would probably be either Demarcus Robinson, because then you're not necessarily telling the story of Stafford having a monster game. You can still play Love, or it would be Kyren Williams, and saying like this actually kind of plays off the fact that we don't have Stafford by putting Kyren Williams on here, hoping that he gets the touchdowns on the ground, and Stafford only throws for 1 or 2 touchdowns in this spot.
I would love to throw Kyren Williams on here, but we are going to be. I feel like we're going to be pretty tight salary wise after this.
Yeah, on a week like this, though, one thing we should think about is, because we can always pivot down, but one thing we should think about is if there aren't going to be a lot of high scores on the slate, like we got to prioritize finding those high scores.
Yeah.
Because otherwise you can fall into that trap of like taking the $4,300 guy instead of the $3,300 guy. And there really might not be that big of a difference between those two guys, but there could be a big difference between, the points that Kyren Williams scores and the points that somebody else scores at running back. Although running back is kind of plentiful this week, but it kind of allows us to tell the story of the Rams having a big game. Also, we have some salary relief from the fact that it is trending toward Brian Robinson missing, which would mean if we're betting on the Rams scoring a lot of points, Antonio Gibson becomes really attractive as an option. Chris Rodriguez will get some of the work on the ground, but Antonio Gibson will have a much bigger role. He's only 5,200. And then, McLaurin is 5,600. I think Dotson's 47. Curtis Samuel's 46. So and the Rams filter a ton of targets towards tight ends as well. So Logan Thomas is in the mix. All these guys are cheap and kind of lowers our salary here. And realistically, we could play 2 of these guys as well. Wouldn't be a bad way to handle things.
Okay, what are your thoughts on Zeke? Because Ramondre didn't practice today, and I'm pretty sure he's not going to play.
Yeah, so generally speaking, I want to take price tags off of my thinking as much as possible and think about who can post a tournament-winning ceiling. I mean, 27 points against Pittsburgh. I do wonder if that is overselling what he's capable of. The 7 catches for 72 yards is the big thing. Yeah, I mean, I hadn't given Zeke much thought to this point in the week, only because I'm thinking like, oh, the game total is so low. What are the chances of the Patriots putting up a big game against Kansas City? I said last week that I thought Buffalo was going to win that game against Kansas City. I actually said I thought Buffalo was going to beat Philadelphia as well. Almost got that one. It's kind of crazy. It wouldn't surprise me if the Patriots win this game. There's now it's come out that the expectations are that Belichick is getting fired at the end of the season. Patriots defense is playing so well. Kansas City offense is running into so many problems. And the way that the Patriots want to play kind of matches up with the only things that you can do to attack Kansas City. I could see this game being like a lot closer than people expect. Zeke being heavily involved in the pass game. So yeah, I mean, I think one thing to think about is there's the field we're competing against, which is like the majority of rosters, right? And there's mistakes that they're going to make. There's things we can do to outmaneuver them. And then there's the people we're competing against for first place, which is the sharpest DFS players who kind of really know what they're doing. And you always see them up in first place. One thing that's cool about the Zeke play is the field might be on him heavier than the sharpest DFS players. The sharpest DFS players are going to be like, well, this game total is so low. The Patriots have a bad offense. And because of that, like that offense is just marked off their list. They're not even thinking about it. So I do think Zeke, like his total ownership will matter less than his ownership on rosters that you're truly competing against for first place. And I don't think he'll be high owned on those rosters. So from that standpoint, it is actually really interesting. Let's throw him on here. Let's go ahead and do it.
All right, cool. And then if we don't have enough, we can always pivot down.
Yeah, and we can always, if we want to use Antonio Gibson, we can play him in the flex. If we want to play one of these, I do think we should play one of these Washington pieces because it's probable that one of them has a solid game in response to what's going on the other side of the ball. but again, it's always hard to kind of figure out where to go among these pieces. So I don't know. Do you see anything else that you would want to do instead of going in that direction?
Like going in the direction of grabbing a Washington piece.
Yeah.
Well, I've actually thought about the Washington, like having a bring back with the Washington piece before, and I'm still kind of in my like thought process phase of it all, just because, like you said, it's really hard to figure out who's going to get the points on that team. And every time I play Washington, I always get it wrong.
Yeah. Yeah. And one of the things that I talk about with like the 49ers, right, is it's hard to guess who's going to hit, but it's probable that somebody does hit. And on these thin slates, it's probable that there's going to be a 49ers piece on the tournament winning roster. And so it's better to guess and get it wrong than to not guess at all and not give yourself a shot at having that piece that everybody's going to be chasing, right? But with the Commanders, it's different because you're guessing, and the score that you get is probably like 16 to 18 to 20 points. So it's not like a score that I mean, it could end up on a tournament winning roster, but it won't be the reason that people are winning tournaments, right? Like if you didn't have Debo last week, you probably weren't winning a tournament. If you didn't have Debo the week before, you probably weren't winning a tournament. If you didn't have Kittle a few weeks before that, you probably weren't winning a tournament, because we haven't had high scoring weeks and these guys have been putting up high scores. Commanders are not like that. So it's easier to be like, yeah, like one of them probably hits, but it's not like, oh, I have to have one of these guys in order to win. So it is fine to leave them off if you don't want to play that guessing game. Though realistically, everything's kind of a guessing game, right? Like the other spots in the slate. So I don't know if you've seen like anything. I do think if we're going to them on this roster, Logan Thomas would make a lot of sense, because the Rams do filter target to the tight end, and we would expect the Commanders to be chasing points. So let's move to the tight end position, because we can kind of save salary and see what we have to work with. Is there somebody besides Logan Thomas who you could see yourself going to on this slate?
No, honestly, I'm totally fine with doing Logan Thomas on this specific build.
Yeah, it fits in with what we are. You know, I will say Darren Waller is potentially coming back this week. He's only 4,400. So that's
you mean like tight end position, not just Washington?
Yeah. Like tight end position. Yeah.
At the moment. But again, I'm still early in the thinking process, and I have like 3 tight ends. So
okay. Who are the other ones that you've been kind of thinking about?
I had Kittle, Trey McBride, and I had Njoku. Okay.
Yeah, on this roster, I guess we throw Logan Thomas in and save the salary. And actually, once we go over to defense, we're going to see that we do have like a decent amount of salary to work with still, especially we could potentially get like a really cheap piece and then get an expensive piece. So defense, I haven't actually spent much time this week thinking about defense. I do think that we could go as cheap as New England, although I'm not allowed to play the New England defense anymore. But they lost my family out on like 30 grand throughout a couple weeks, and Abby was like, "You cannot play the Patriots defense." You know, the Jets against Miami with a hobbled Tyreek Hill. I don't know. Have you seen any cheap defenses that you like?
Well, I mean, if we're playing the story, the narrative of it being a low scoring game for the Bills Cowboys, what are your thoughts on the Bills themselves, like as a defense?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not against it, honestly. You know, Dak's turnovers last year were overstated. Like his turnover worthy play rate wasn't dramatically higher than it had been throughout his career. So he doesn't turn the ball over much. You know, it's a good offense, but also just in terms of, we looked at the Bills scores, right? I mean, it's consistently, you know, they're always positive points, but outside of like the Philly game, their home, or that was actually on the road as well. So like their home games, they're generally going to put up 6+ Draftkings points. They did it against Miami. They've not really played a lot of other great offenses at home, but no, I don't mind it if we're going to just spend down and see what else we can do. I think the Giants are also interesting from like a standpoint of they could actually put up a tournament winning type of score, right? If we want to think about that, because Derek Carr is completely banged up. That offense is completely broken, and the Giants have been playing really well lately. They're only 300 more in salary. So I think that's the way that we could go as well. But yeah, I'll let you kind of pick what we want to do at defense here.
Yeah, let's do Giants. Before we move on though, what are your thoughts on like So my whole thought process with picking the Bills was, we're going to say that we're not going to play any Bills or any of those pieces from that game. Do we want to grab the defense on either side of that, saying that like it's not going to be high scoring? One of the defenses has to go off probably. Would that be a good thought process, or is that something you usually?
Yeah, so there's I would think a little more nuance in it because the Bills and Cowboys core pieces are so high priced that it could be like a 26-24 game, and the defense special teams units don't produce tournament winning scores, and none of these offensive players had to have it pieces at their price tags. And that's probably the likeliest way for that game to play out, is just kind of in that middle range where the defenses don't really help you, the offenses don't really help you enough at their salaries. The more like the deeper core though of what you're getting at here is just like, we always want to think about that strategy of when two things are equal, which one provides us more of a strategy edge. Like the Giants is just taking a shot on the defense that could score points, whereas the Bills is taking a shot on a defense that if they're scoring points, it's not only helping our rosters, but hurting other rosters. So if it were a tiebreaker situation, then I'd be like, well, let me just lean toward the Bills. I wouldn't say it's necessarily a tiebreaker situation because you've got this aggressive Giants defense taking on a Saints offense that's been pretty broken versus like a more bend but don't break type Bills defense taking on a really good Cowboys offense. So that strategy angle is what pulls it much closer. And if it were a tiebreaker, I would just be like, yeah, go to the Bills, because that's how we should always think on our rosters. Any play like last week, it wasn't that, like I said, I had 40% Amari, right? It wasn't that Amari was like a 40% player last week to where, let's say Amari had been healthy all week. I wouldn't have been like, oh, I've got to get 40% Amari Cooper. But it was that he had the concussion and everyone spent all week expecting him to not play. Everyone was on Elijah Moore at 4,500, and the news came out Saturday night that Amari was going to play, and it was like, oh my gosh, like I know how the DFS field works. Like people are going to move off of Elijah Moore, but not enough, right? I think he still ended up being like 10 or 12% owned because they don't want to change their rosters and their thoughts, and people aren't going to pivot over to Amari. And it's like Amari was 5,800. He scored 27 plus points more than anyone else like over the last year and a half with just moderately good quarterback play. And it's like the fact that you could get a 30-point score. Amari was like 2 to 3% owned in all the tournaments I was in last week. So it's like the fact that you could get a 30-point score, a separator score at 5,800 on a guy that nobody else is rostering, like that strategy edge was what made me be like, he's going on 40% of my rosters. So I say that just to kind of illustrate how I think through those things. Like if it had just been, he's healthy all week, they're playing the Jags, I would have been like, oh yeah, Amari's a good play. I'll put him on 12 to 15% of my rosters. But the fact that he was going to be so low owned immediately made him more powerful. Or like I pivoted all my rosters, any defense rosters where I had the salary last week, I pivoted to the 49ers on Sunday morning because it was announced that Geno Smith was going to be out. We didn't hear that until shortly before kickoff of the early games. And the 49ers had scored 8 or more defense special teams points against Seattle in 4 straight games with Geno starting. So it's like, well, at worst, they're going to score like 8 or 9 points. But at best, they could score 15, 20 against Drew Lock, and people aren't going to pivot enough, right? And again, 49ers were like 4% owned. And so it wasn't like they were, all of a sudden, they were like 40% of my defense exposure. It's not like they were that much better of a defense than everyone else. It's just like, oh, there's now an edge here because people aren't on them. So that's just some more insight. I mean, you and I have talked about this type of stuff. So I know you're thinking this way. People who are in the OWS community are thinking this way. So this is kind of more talking through some of this stuff for those of you who are newer to this type of thinking. But yeah, always want to think about the strategy angle where we can. On this one, I would say it's not really a tiebreaker so much as it pulls the Bills up a little bit more, but I still kind of prefer the Giants defense. So yeah, I mean, I love that question. I think it's like a sharp way to kind of think through these decisions for sure.
Great. Yeah. And I mean, like that, like you said, that doesn't apply just to the defense. It really applies to every position.
Everywhere. Yeah. Any place where we have tiebreakers, we don't want to be like, oh, let me predict what's going to happen. Which, by the way, Amari did end up seeing 14 targets last week. Only had he was like 7 for 77 and had a fumble, so it didn't actually like work out. But it was like, man, this dude could have had a monster game on that volume. Yeah, man, we're actually like salary wise, it's pretty interesting now because we talked already about there's not going to be a lot of 30-point scores on this slate, and one of them probably comes from the 49ers. We actually have the salary to go to like a 49ers piece and then something else. Or, if we wanted, we could try to play the prediction game in the mid-range and try to outscore the 49ers pieces. I don't think either angle is wrong necessarily. Although like kind of in the mid-range, right? Like Garrett Wilson had his best career game last week with Zach Wilson under center. Like that was the best that he'd ever done with Zach Wilson. And it was 23 points, I don't know what there is kind of in this, no wide receivers top 77 yards against Chicago since week 2. And you got Amari at 6K. Gabe Davis against the Cowboys, who don't give up much production to wide receivers. Drake London against the Panthers, who don't give up much production to wide receivers. So, I don't really know who we would be going to in this mid-range. Any thoughts on your end on how you want to attack these final couple spots?
I would love to grab CMC, and I'm trying to see what we can do to maybe squeeze him in.
We could do, what is he? Is he 9,200 this week?
Yeah, he's 93.
9,300. So if we do it, we're going to, 3,500. Good Lord.
I got rid of Zeke, grabbed Antonio Gibson.
Okay. Yeah, I was going to say we're going to have to grab a tight end. Yeah, bro. I mean, that's pretty interesting. That's genuinely pretty interesting. 3,500 or below. Demarcus Robinson is 3,600.
What do we got on defense? Hold on. It would just be fun to have this lineup with Kyren Williams and CMC.
Yeah, and I mean, realistically, the point here is to kind of work through our thoughts and see what we're capable of doing on this slate. I mean, you kind of push around the pieces on this puzzle like it's a slide puzzle, right? Like you could spend an hour with this roster and be like, okay, how do I want to move this one around? I mean, even at quarterback, isn't Stafford 6K? So you could go down from Jordan Love to Matthew Stafford on this roster and free up the extra 200 as well, and then throw Demarcus Robinson on here and be like, bro, I've got Demarcus Robinson, Puka Nacua, and Kyren Williams, and Matthew Stafford, and Antonio Gibson as the bringback, and all of a sudden it's become one of these. Antonio Gibson and Logan Thomas as the bringback. Actually, we almost force ourselves with this roster to do the Stafford move because we now have 2 Washington pieces, and we're trying to get Demarcus Robinson 3 Rams pieces, and it goes back to this thing of saying now we're telling the story of this game combining for 60 plus points, which I haven't calculated the numbers, but it's been a massive percentage of Washington games have combined for 60 plus points. Now we're telling the story of this game combining for 60 plus points and all the other games on the slate kind of underwhelming. And Christian McCaffrey being the sole scorer in the 49ers game, which he was the last time they played the Cardinals, put up 51 DraftKings points in that one. This is a really clear story we're telling where we need one thing to go, 2 things to go right. We need Rams and Washington to shoot out, and we need Christian McCaffrey to dominate the scoring for the 49ers. And if we do that, we are one or 2 of these pieces from the Rams and Commanders is going to miss, and yet it doesn't matter. We're going to score over 200 points and outscore the field. And another cool thing here is we do have flexibility. Jayden Reed we're no longer married to Jayden Reed on this roster, so we can move Jayden Reed around and Demarcus Robinson around and find other ways to play that those final 2 spots. But I mean, even with those 2, it's a pretty tremendous roster, honestly.
Yeah, I totally agree. It was really cool to do that, and it helps us learn to be flexible and not stuck on one idea.
Yeah, it illustrates that point of when in doubt, we should think not about what we want to predict is going to happen, but think about there was a week last year, and I forget what the situation was around it, but it was Alvin Kamara and Austin Eckler were pretty equal plays. I actually liked Austin Eckler quite a bit more, but on paper, they were pretty equal. But the strategy angle on Alvin Kamara was way stronger. So I ended up going twice as much ownership on Kamara as Austin Eckler, even though I liked Eckler more as a play. And on that particular week, it worked out to where Kamara outscored Eckler by 12 points or something like that. And so it was the fact that I didn't marry what I thought was going to happen and instead let what would make me the most money over time make my decision for me. You see how that ends up playing out to where, the more we can let go, we kind of start from that point of predicting. We don't want to just go to bad plays because we want to recognize that we can predict what's likeliest to happen in games and who's likely to get the work. But we also want to understand that there's a lot that we can't predict. And so as long as we're positioning ourselves for what makes us the most money, it became a really interesting roster. How it's we want it, we can build a Jordan Love roster, right? And end up going that direction, but really cool to start with the Jordan Love and then kind of see how this tilts us in a different direction. For anybody who's wondering, like, yes, this is a viable roster in terms of like, are there too many Rams pieces on here? Are there too many Washington pieces on here? If this ends up being, a 38-31 game or something like that, on this slate where 7 games could all finish, below 42, 43 points, like, then this ends up grabbing enough total points from this group of players that like this could win you a tournament of 10,000 entries, 25,000 entries, 50,000 entries. So a sharp way to put this roster together. Basically bet on 2 things happening. We want that game to shoot out, and we want Christian McCaffrey to get all the points for the 49ers. Both those are very viable. So any final thoughts from your end before we get out of here?
No, it's just a funny way how we did it, but I'm happy with the final result. So
yeah, it was a good little training session in terms of like seeing how we can be flexible with a build, and especially with practice builds, because part of the purpose of practice builds should be forcing ourselves to like make moves and think outside the box and like push us onto plays and situations and constructions that we might not have thought of through our logical mind. So we were able to do that as well. Keegan and I will be back here tomorrow, Friday. We will, that goes live on YouTube and the OWS podcast feed on Friday night or Saturday morning. So technically we will see each other tomorrow. We will see you guys back here on Saturday. We will see you on OWS throughout the weekend, and we will see you at the top of the leaderboards on Sunday.